legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Sunlit world of what he believes to be reality. But there is, unseen by most, an underworld, a place that is just as real, but not as brightly lit.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Anthony Peake, who joins us to discuss his book, The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. Since our very beginnings, human beings from all civilisations across the earth have encountered the others, intelligent, self-motivated beings that are clearly not human in their origins. Peake offers a comprehensive survey of such otherworldly visitors, from gods, angels, demons and djinn, to hobgoblins, poltergeists and ghosts, to UFOs and aliens. In addition to detailing the history of these encounters, the author attempts a bold explanation of the true nature of these beings. He explores the increasingly frequent entheogen encounters facilitated by substances such as ayahuasca, DMT and LSD, as well as the entities encountered by individuals suffering from Alzheimer-related Charles Bonnet syndrome, young children's so-called invisible friends, and the seemingly independent beings met during lucid dreaming and near-death and out-of-body experiences. This book continues Anthony Peake's work in developing a completely original model of reality based upon an amalgamation of ancient belief systems, subjective human experiences of the extraordinary, and the latest discoveries of neurology, neurochemistry, quantum mechanics, and cosmology. This model proposes that consciousness, far from being simply an accident of evolution, is the fundamental source of the material universe. It suggests that at its most basic level, everything that is seemingly physical is rendered into existence by consciousness. Hello and welcome, Anthony, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Absolutely wonderful. I think it's my fifth time on the show, and I've just recently posted on Facebook. I think that I've done your show more times than any other show I've done over the last 10 years.
Wow. So, yeah, it's at least 5 times, but
at least.
Well, anyone who enjoys this can find the links to all the previous shows on the page for the show at legalizefreedom.com. But in any event, we're together today because we're going to be talking about your latest book. It's entitled The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. Before we jump into that, as per usual, just give, for listeners who don't know, a little bit about yourself, your background, your work in general.
Yeah, okay. This is my 11th book. All my books deal with a similar subject, which is understanding what the role of consciousness is and what the role of reality is and how the two interface. My philosophy has always been to do the science first and then actually start to move into areas of speculation after you've built the groundwork of the science, because I very much believe in the old diktat of Marcello Trui that extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And I like to make sure that my readers make up their own decisions by referencing in all of my books extensive references to academic papers and everything else as well. Originally I was from Merseyside, but I've lived all across the UK. And it's over the last, 20 years or so that I've really focused myself on to writing. And have really enjoyed it. My books seem to sell comparatively well. I mean, it was sold around about 100,000 worldwide now, and it's in most major European languages and many minor European languages. And breaking news, this new book, it's the first time ever that a foreign rights deal has been negotiated before the book was actually published, which is fascinating. And I'm delighted to say the first book language this book will be out in will be Greek. And indeed, the Greek publisher was so interested in my work after meeting me over coffee that the next day he was over in the UK. He had a series of meetings and he was over from Athens. And he actually shot off and went to my publisher Arcturus and bought the rights to Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. And both those books will be out in Greek in about 3 months' time. So all very exciting times at the moment.
Oh, splendid. That's very good news all round. Now, about this new book, in some ways it has been prompted, if not all, then many of your other books, in which you have discussed non-human entities, non-human intelligences and encounters with them. And you were prompted, I think you could explain this in more detail yourself, but you were prompted to sort of say, what is the common thread here? You know, I wrote about this subject and this idea came up. I wrote about another subject and the same idea came up. So is there something tying this all together? So does that sound accurate?
No, very much so. All through my writings, from writing on near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, entheogens like dimethyltryptamine, one of the major themes of all of these is that when people are in these altered states of consciousness, they encounter other intelligences. Now, whether these intelligences are just simply projections of our own subconscious, or whether they have some form of independent existence, is something that has long intrigued me. And in the book, my investigation is very, very all-consuming in the sense that I review entities and entity encounters right from thousands of years ago, right up to the modern day. And indeed, what stimulated it was my own mother, who had an extraordinary experience where in a state of hypnagogia or sleep paralysis in her bedroom, she encountered a grey. And she described this grey in very distinct terms. She phoned me up the next day after the encounter. And this entity, what disturbed me a great deal was my mother lives on her own. And this entity, she woke up in the middle of the night, and this entity, she saw her door open, and this entity came through the door, looked at her, and realized that my mother had seen it, and it reacted. It dodged back behind the door. And when she described it, she said it had huge black eyes and 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. And my mother wouldn't know a classic grey if it bit her on the backside. She's just not in that world, or she wasn't. She's no longer with us. But clearly, whatever she saw was an archetype. And it's an archetype that goes right back. I mean, in the introduction to the book, I discuss the experiences of Graham Hancock. In his book Supernatural, he describes how he came across a series of curious cave paintings down in the Didymir Gorge in the Drakensberg Mountain in South Africa, a place called the Junction Shelter. And these beings were exactly the same as my mother had seen. But I subsequently discovered that around about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, there were a series of caves that were discovered quite by accident in northern India, in near 2 villages called Chandili and Gotitola in northern India. And this cave system, as far as they could tell, were inhabited 10,000 years ago and have been sealed for 10,000 years. They opened up the caves and they're full of cave paintings. And the cave paintings are fascinating because a lot of the entities on the cave paintings are greys. They have huge black eyes. They have a very strange shaped skull, which kind of sort of bulges at the back. And people have argued, and they will say that, oh, well, of course, ancient people didn't know how to paint properly, and therefore these are idealized human figures. I always argue that this is not the case, because if you look at the paintings, say, in Los Caseros in Spain, and the paintings that are found at Lascaux, these our ancestors certainly knew how to paint leopards and bison and cattle very, very precisely. So these creatures are literally, they are not ideal types. They are depictions of something that they did see. Now, the question is, did they see these entities as part of their normal environment? Did they see them when they were shamanic traveling? Did they see them when they took mind-altering substances? We know that psilocybin and magic mushrooms and the mystical substance called soma has been known for generations. And I discussed this in one of my earlier books, Opening the Doors of Perception, and indeed the infinite minefield. And in both of these, I'm interested in hallucinogenic substances and how these entities are encountered there. So that's the basic premise of the book. It's, well, what are these creatures? Are they real? Are they genuine? And if they are, can I come up with a scientific analysis and a scientific model to explain what these creatures may be? And I believe I successfully do this. It's for my readers to decide whether I'm successful in doing it. But I'm quite pleased with the conclusions I come to.
Just as a brief aside, footnote, by the way, the greys that you referred to, I know you've described them quite accurately. That's simply that what many people will know as the classic image of E.T., you know, the Whitley Strieber type, big dark eyes, as you say, 2 holes for a nose, slit for a mouth, bulbous head. That's what your mother saw, and what, you know, this image has persisted throughout, time immemorial.
Actually, Greg, as an interesting aside there, I'm doing an event with Whitley Strieber in California at the end of May, and Whitley interviewed me for his podcast 2 weeks ago, and he's absolutely staggered about the conclusions I'm coming to. He is so excited about them. It's unreal. You know, he's saying there's so many people I've got to introduce you to. And he thinks that the book is absolutely revolutionary. And this is the man himself. You know, this is Strieber himself. And he thinks the book is absolutely revolutionary. So I'm really quite pleased with that.
Yeah, well, he changed the face of ufology, sort of alien lore, everything with his own experiences and his writing. But one of the key ideas that you build your case upon is this idea that is ancient and it persists throughout spiritual traditions, and science has been revealing it to us in the modern era. And that is that the level of reality that you and I are experiencing right now, sharing together, is just one of many. To use spiritual or religious terms, there are upper, middle, and lower worlds, just as there are these different layers of reality. And in fact, the only worldview of the many, many worldviews that really denies, derides, or pushes this idea aside is the hardcore materialist worldview. You know, almost everyone else seems to think that, yeah, we understand that what we perceive with our 5 senses is just a fraction of what there is.
No, absolutely. I mean, and this is the tragedy of material reductionism, in that it's a profoundly successful model of how physical reality works, but it is at a loss to explain consciousness. It's at a loss to explain hallucinations. It's at a loss to explain anything that cannot be broken down into its component parts. And of course, quantum physics has now shown that the materialist reductionist model, which effectively quantum physics was discovered because of it, the whole thing breaks down there as well. You know, the idea that what we believe to be solid reality is nothing of the sort. In the book, I open the book with a discussion of, in 1773, the famous British dictionary writer Samuel Johnson was walking in the Scottish mountains with his biographer Boswell, and they were discussing the writings of Berkeley, the Irish philosopher cleric. And Berkeley had written a series of books about idealism, the idea that thought is prime and consciousness is prime, and physical reality is an emanation of consciousness. And of course, Samuel Johnson did his famous argumentatum ad lapidem, where he kicked a stone. That's the argument from the stone in Latin. And he kicked a stone and he said, I refute it thus. And in the book, I very much break that down to show just how utterly ridiculous that argument is, because reality, and I break it down and I say, right, let's just look at the kind of stone he would have kicked. It would have been possibly granite. Now, one of the main components of granite is something like aluminium, maybe. Now, that's made up of 14 protons and 14 neutrons. Now, if you then expanded that atom to a sphere 1 kilometer in size, the actual central physical part of it, the 14 protons and neutrons, would be a 1 centimeter sphere in the center of that vast nothingness. And whizzing round would be 13 electrons, which are point particles. And that is it. The atom is 99 to the power of 13 empty space. And just to clarify that, that means 99.99999999996 empty space. And even the things that are physical within that, the supposedly physical protons and neutrons, are indeed themselves not prime particles. They're made up of quarks, and quarks themselves are point particles. So suddenly everything we think is physically real suddenly disappears in a puff of empirical science. And of course, we never touch anything, because the only reason you don't go through the chair, and the only reason that anything is seemingly solid, is because of electrostatic repulsion between the edges of these atoms and the atoms of your fingers, or the atoms of your backside, or whatever. So suddenly the idea that there are other realities beyond ours is suddenly logical and self-evident, rather than not at all. You know, we know that 94% of the universe is missing. You know, the rest of the universe is made up of dark matter and dark energy, but we don't know what dark matter and dark energy are. We don't know fully how the principle of black holes take place. It has recently been discovered that literally information itself has mass, that information has a physicality about it. And the logical argument now is that everything at its baseline is information, and information needs something to process it, and that's consciousness.
Yeah, and indeed, as you basically said a moment ago, under that consciousness-based model of reality, all that is categorized as paranormal or supernatural suddenly becomes part of normal or natural, because even though we can't necessarily explain it as yet, or maybe ever, but it becomes, as you say, not only feasible, but actually to be expected. And that's the game changer. And when you also consider it that way, then if you stick to the materialist paradigm, then most of what we seem to experience, most of what's out there, suddenly is paranormal or supernatural. And I would say, if that's the case, if 90% of what it seems to be out there is coming under these mystical categories, and maybe you need to think again about your definitions, about your model.
No, absolutely. It's one of these things that, I talk when I lecture and I talk and I do debates and things with materialist reductionists. And as I say, I don't have a problem with material reductionism. It's very successful. The reason we're now communicating now is because of the successes of material reductionism. It has given us a great deal, but it is incomplete. Mm-hmm. It's incomplete in the sense that, for instance, even at its basic level, the very, very large objects within the universe are explained by Einsteinian physics, and the very, very small is explained by quantum physics. And yet the two are completely mutually incompatible. The actual calculations and the formulae used to calculate the world of the quantum do not work in any shape or form if they're plugged into the calculations and formulae that are used in terms of Einstein physics. So clearly there is a hidden, as Einstein himself said, there are hidden variables. My great hero scientifically is David Bohm, Professor David Bohm. And of course, David Bohm argued this, that there are hidden variables that seem to be akin in many ways to holographics, that seem to be linked in some way to information. And an awful lot of researchers these days are rapidly coming to the conclusion that this is some form of digital simulation, and that what we think is physical reality is built up of information. And not only that, but the information that we are existing within is some form of three-dimensional illusion, something similar to a virtual reality headset. Now, this then can explain a great deal of the nature of reality that mystifies us. because suddenly there's an explanation of where consciousness fits in with this, because of course consciousness is the hard problem of modern science. Modern science has no idea and is not even at first base of understanding how chemicals and electricity in my brain create me, create my hopes and my dreams, create Greg Moffat and your hopes and dreams. How indeed it is as well, and I was discussing this with somebody yesterday, as to how the magic of the fact of how my words are actually hitting your ears and you are making sense of what is basically vocalizations by a fairly advanced chimpanzee or a fairly advanced monkey. And these noises, and that's all they are actually transferring across through space to your ears, are turning into vibrations in your ears, and your brain then processes that into ideas again. It's absolutely incredible how even at that basic level it works.
And we're led to believe, or encouraged to believe, that all of this occurred randomly for no reason from mud, basically. You know, why on earth would that happen?
Exactly. It's the idea, isn't it? That if there's only ever been one universe, I mean, as we know from the cosmic anthropic principle, that if there's only ever been one universe, it got everything right first time, every time, for consciousness to evolve. Now, if the many worlds interpretation is correct, the Hugh Everett III idea, and variations on the Hugh Everett III, well, there's been trillions of universes, or there are trillions of universes, and we happen to exist in the one that's perfect for life. But at the moment, we don't know whether the many worlds interpretation is correct. So we have to work on the assumption that there's been one universe and it got it right first time.
My issue, or sort of further question when people use the word simulation, is that for something to be a simulation, either it has to be simulating something that already exists or previously existed, or something that somebody has theorized could exist. So, we'll simulate it and see how that goes. Like a flight training program or something. So I wonder sometimes when people use the word simulation, if they really mean that, or if it's just that this is the way things are. If we take the sort of information-based reality models you're talking about, and actually the word simulation is maybe not quite what people mean,
Yeah, it is a wrong term. I mean, the simulation it suggests that, as you say, a simulation is a simulation of something that is real somewhere else. I mean, it's almost the Plato idea of the Platonic forms, that we exist within a simulation that is a denuded version of this pure place, the pleroma, the place of the gods, and everything that exists here are just facsimiles of that reality. But I think it's more complex than that. Now, I know that other writers have argued that we could be existing in a simulation that has been simulated by our distant ancestors. The idea that we're existing in our distant descendants, and we're existing in an ancestor sim. And I know that this was the original model that was put forward by Bostrom back in 1999 when he wrote the famous paper about it. That, I think, is interesting, but it's probably a little bit simplistic, and we're probably anthropomorphizing this thing. The very fact that anything exists at all is a mystery, because effectively the more simple things tend to be the way forward. So to have this incredibly complex universe, why does a complex universe exist when it'd be far more simple? The universe didn't exist at all. So the question is, what is it? And I think when we use the term simulation theory, I think all we're arguing is that reality is digital. The base of reality is digital and not physical. And that's it. And we can't really go any further than this. And of course, these are the arguments put forward by great thinkers such as Stephen Hawking, with his top-down hypothesis of quantum physics, which he did with Frank Hartle of CERN. Also, the idea of the model is now starting to make more sense, because they're now doing the mechanism of this, whereby they think it's something to do with black holes, it's something to do with the Schwarzschild radius, it's something to do with the way information is smeared on the edge, on the outside of black holes, and something called Hawking radiation, which I haven't got time to go into the technicalities of at the moment. But this is a very beguiling model, and it is a very effective model for explaining what we experience. But this means there are other levels of reality that are all encoded within this reality. And as you rightly said, the argument of the shamanic model of the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And this is consistent across virtually every civilization. And again, every civilization across the world also has entities. They also have these beings that seem to come through from somewhere else and break through into this reality, or can be encountered in altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, and that brings me neatly onto my next point, actually, which is one, it sits alongside, builds on this idea of multiple levels of reality, and that is that the same entities encountered by different people, not just different people as in you and I being different, and having perhaps, doing ayahuasca or something, or having a similar dream encounter, but different peoples separated by time, separated by distance, separated by tradition and culture. And some of these common entities you detail in the book, going right back to ancient civilizations across the ages, and you find these commonalities. Now, sometimes they're spoken about and recorded differently, but it's quite often in the imagery when the similarities become the most striking. But that led you and many others to ask, well, do these entities then have some kind of reality in and of themselves, some kind of independent reality, if Anthony Peake and Greg Moffat can experience them in their own way at different times?
Oh, totally. And it's one of the things that is fascinating me at the moment, and I'm getting feedback on a kind of fairly regular basis about it, is that there is a research project taking place at the moment at Imperial College in London, financed by a British multimillionaire called Anton Bilton. And what they're doing is they have a group of volunteers who are having injected into them dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the hallucinogenic substance. This is under controlled circumstances and it's completely legal. And what is happening is these individuals are taking DMT trips and they're coming back and they're reporting back as to what they encounter. Now, many of the people involved in this are postdoctoral students. So these guys are extremely bright. They're psychologists, they're neurologists, they're people who really know their stuff. And one of them who's part of my extended group is a guy called Dr. Carl Smith. And Carl is doing some fascinating work in his own right in virtual reality and simulating virtual reality and discussing about how perception works in terms of virtual reality. But he's one of the volunteers, and he was telling me that he, when he first took the DMT intravenously, he found himself in what's called the DMT zone, the DMT cage, which is a kind of a location you find yourself in. You rock it out of your body and you find yourself in this place. And he said while he was there, this entity came over to him and prodded him and said, "You're doing this wrong. This is not how you should be doing it. Please do not do this again. You should not be doing it this way." And he then came to. And then 2 weeks later, he is injected again. He goes back. He finds himself in exactly the same location. And exactly the same creature comes over to him and said, "I told you last time. Please do not do it this way. It's the wrong way of doing it." Now, as he said to me, that entity, if it was part of his subconscious, it was telling him things he didn't want to hear. He wanted to think he was doing it well. So it wasn't fulfilling any form of expectations, and it was consistent in its message. Now, he is convinced that that entity was real, that entity was motivated, and that entity knew that they were doing it in the wrong way. Because, of course, the logical argument is you shouldn't be doing it this way. You should be training yourself. You don't decide to actually go pearl diving without any training, without teaching yourself how to breathe correctly. Or if you go scuba diving and everything else, you have to be trained to do it. But we seem to dive into these alternate states of consciousness just at a whim. We just give ourselves the drugs and we go there. But, of course, we're not trained. And this is why people in traditions like the Tibetan dream yoga and other people within shamanism, they're trained over a long period of time to be able to go to these places. But it seems to suggest that there are ways and means by which we can communicate with these entities. And the shamans and the ayahuasqueros in Latin America and other individuals in what would be termed more traditional societies who are closer to nature than we are. Because, of course, we live in this cocooned world, modern man, whereby we live in houses. We don't interface with nature. We rarely sleep under the stars. A friend of mine, she is now regularly taking herself out every morning and walking in bare feet on grass just to give her a linkage with the earth. That's, and I totally agree with that. We need to get back to the basics and not be so arrogant to assume that just because these people are in traditional societies, that they are somehow primitive. Their brains are identical to ours. So therefore their logical processes are identical to ours. They respond to the things they see, and we have done since the time immemorial. To just dismiss it just because you don't experience it, therefore it is not real. Because I know people who, when they lucid dream, when they have out-of-body experiences, they encounter other entities, they encounter other intelligences, and they encounter other human beings in these states. And these people report back into this reality, which I call the konoma. The reality they go into, I call the pleroma. And they come back into the konoma, into the simulation, for want of a better term, and they bring back information. And this is self-evident that the other reality is just as real, or indeed as many people who take DMT, and definitely 5-MeO DMT, say it's actually more real. This is the illusion. This is the dream.
Yeah, exactly. And once you start to have some of the experiences you've described, then you begin to contemplate the idea that the reality that you and I are currently sharing is not only the most real reality that there is, and not only the only reality there is, but that it may actually be, on the contrary, an incredibly limited reality. That was the idea that, perhaps most famously articulated in the 20th century by Aldous Huxley, in his idea of consciousness and the reducing valve, and that what the world you and I are sharing right now is just a little tiny sliver of reality. But what you were referring to a moment ago brings us on to the idea of these entities.
Can I just very quickly just butt in there?
Yeah,
just
of course,
quite an important point to make.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that the whole Aldous Huxley principle and the C.D. Broad and Henri Bergson has recently been proven. There's been very recent research being done at the University of Sussex, whereby they have been doing fMRI scans of people's brains while they're under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And what they wanted to do was to find out what parts of the brain lit up when somebody took magic mushrooms and started to hallucinate, so they could actually do some kind of Penfield-like mapping of the brain. Much to their absolute surprise, they discovered that psilocybin actually switches parts of the brain off. In other words, it stops the attenuator being effective. It stops the brain's reducing valve being able to reduce. And that is incredible news. That, for the first time, is telling us actual physical empirical proof using modern scientific methods, proving that the brain is indeed a reducing valve, and that these substances switch off the brain's ability to switch other bits off, and they open up the doors of perception. So your point there is an incredibly valid one.
My version of that is kind of like the difference between the light, artificial light, the light that we generate, and the light from the sun, stars, whatever the stars, of course, which are other suns. We take them to be the same thing, but they're not. And what you're describing in my mind is a little bit like turning off the street lights in a city. And the more street lights you turn off, the more stars you can see.
Great analogy. Great analogy. You should patent that one. That's very good.
Well, it's here it is in broadcast, so I can refer back to this, if anyone rips it off. But to pick up the point I got into a moment ago, so yeah, these entities, what you were saying prior to our little detour there, are they subjectively or objectively real? Now, if I have a dream encounter, not under the influence of any substance or anything, and I encounter an entity or entities in my dream, I would be very surprised if you encountered the same people, creatures, entities in your dream, just your normal nighttime REM dream state. But it could happen, and it has been recorded. Some of the experiences you've been describing begin to really make us ask, well, if people are encountering, if one person's encountering the same entity as you described, that person a moment ago, again and again in the same place and same circumstances with a narrative thread continuing. Like, look, I told you before, I've met you before, I know who you are, you know who I am. I'm here, you're there, and we meet together. But the question then becomes, are these entities then, when we're not experiencing them or with them, are they doing something else? So that gentleman who had the DMT experience, is the entity that was interacting with him, is it just an entity for him? Is that entity interacting with other consciousnesses who are having the same sort of experience? Does that entity have a life, to, for want of a better word, like you or I have? Then you begin to get into the whole subjective objective question, which is hotly debated, brought to bear on so many subjects, but actually in many of these, it's kind of like a false dichotomy. You mentioned this in the context of the occult section of your book and Aleister Crowley. It's like it almost doesn't matter if these entities have any objective reality. It's kind of like the experience, the outcome.
Totally. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, there's so many themes I could draw out from that. I mean, the first one that intrigues me is in the introduction to the book, I discuss a particular incident that was told to me by one of my associates, Samantha Treasure, who's a graduate anthropologist. And she told me that when she was a young girl, when she was at school, she had a very, very vivid dream. And in the dream, her sister let in a white cat in the dream. Now, Sam now writes about lucid dreaming and out of the body experiences. So she goes into the alternate realms. But when she was younger, she'd had a series of curious experiences, and this was one of them. And in the dream, her sister lets in this white cat, and the white cat goes into Sam's bedroom and it speaks to her. And she wakes up, and this dream really quite disturbed her. She goes into school the next day, and between classes, she gets talking to one of her friends who was a kind of a deep outsider character within the school. And the character, this guy started talking to her, and he said, "Your dream last night?" And Sam said, "Yes." And he said, "You dreamt about a white cat that your sister let in, didn't you?" And Sam said, "Yes, I did." She said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "The cat then spoke to you, didn't it?" And she said, "Yes." "How do you know?" And he said, "Because I was that white cat." Now, that means that other people can actually, under certain circumstances, seem to be able to get into other people's dreams. Now, that's the first point. So some of the entities that we're likely to meet in dreamscapes are actually fellow human beings who are also dreaming in dream states, like in lucid dreaming and consensual dreaming. That's the first point. The second point is the reality of the non-human entities that we encounter in these experiences. And I think that it's far more interesting than simply that they exist somewhere out there. I believe, and this is where I use the term egregorial, and I'm quite precise in my use of the term egregorial, because it's actually a term that has been used many, many times, right back to biblical times, and right back to the Book of Enoch, the apocryphal gospel. It's not part of the canon, but except in the Eritrean church and in the church, the Coptic Christian church in Ethiopia, where this book of Enoch is. And Enoch, I think, was the grandfather of Noah, supposedly. But in this book, he describes in great detail entities that he called the Watchers. And the Watchers came from heaven and came down to earth on Mount Hermon in Lebanon. And these creatures then procreated with women, and they created the idea, the biblical line of there were giants in those days, the Nephilim. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the word watcher in Greek is egregore. Okay, so here we have a link with the idea of egregorials. Right back through time, we have a semantic link, a linguistic link with these entities. But the egregore is a term that's used in magical terms, and it's now become part of psychological discussions, because an egregore is a manifestation of when a group of consciousnesses get together. They can create something that's greater than the individual consciousnesses. For instance, I'm reminded of a very famous book written a few years ago called The Mass Psychology of Crowds. The idea that when you get a large number of people together, there is something created which is greater than them. And of course, this is what the fascist leaders and the communist leaders learned very early on in the early 20th century. You know, the Nuremberg rallies, for instance, they were creating egregores. National Socialism was an egregore. It's something that is greater. Even Coca-Cola and branding are egregores. They seem to take on a life that is greater than the people that create it. Now, there's been a series of experiments done. Now, I'll go back to Alexander Neal, who was she was a Belgian-French lady adventurer in the 1920s, the teens and the 20s. And she took herself off to Tibet. And when she was there, she trained herself in Tibetan magical law. And one of the things that Tibetan magic discusses is the creation of tulpas, which are thought forms that you can create and manipulate. And she and her group created a thought form, and it was a monk. They created this monk that then existed in three-dimensional consensual reality that they all saw. But then as time went on, this entity started to take on a mind of its own. It seemed to become independent. It was as if it was an entity from somewhere else that was actually using their life force, their energy, to draw itself into reality and feed off them. So it's the idea that these entities in some way are part of us. They're part of our subconscious, but they use part of our energy to bring themselves here. So there's a direct link between the observer and the observed. Now, again, in 1970, a group of researchers at the University of Toronto created a character, a ghost. They created a person that had lived in 17th century England. And they named him and they gave him a backstory. And again, he started to manifest with the Ouija board. He started to manifest poltergeist activity and everything else as well. But they had created him. He didn't exist. Now, again, what is this telling us? It means that reality is far more malleable. And if it's made of if it's at its basic form, it's information. And information is thought and is processed by thought. Suddenly we can create these beings and they have sort of independence of us, but not. And my final point is, the entities, what do they do when we're not there? Well, it depends whether their idea of time and what time is for them is the same as time for us. It could be that entity, it was a continuum, that the week that he was away, taking his DMT trips, for that entity could have been instantaneous, or maybe not. But the book, I'm trying to build up this model of saying, well, what are these beings? And I'm coming to the conclusion that they are far more complex. There's some of them, for instance, I have a whole section on the djinn. Now, in the Quran, it explains that djinn were created out of smokeless fire. That's plasma. It seems that plasma, and of course plasma is this additional type of matter that is only been comparatively recently discovered. And again, a researcher friend of mine, Paul Eno, who's an American researcher into ghosts and things, he believes that these creatures manifest themselves out of plasma, and they feed off us. They feed off our fear. They need our fear in order to actually get nutrition in one way or another. So suddenly it's starting to get very strange and not ever so slightly disturbing.
A couple of things I was put in mind of when you were speaking there in terms of pop culture, where in Forbidden Planet, you're probably aware of, the very famous sci-fi movie. In that, there's the Id monster that terrorizes the inhabitants of the planet, and that there's a crew of the spaceship that arrive and to assess the situation, and they too confront and battle with the Id monster, and the clue's in the name, and this physical, periodic, sporadic physical manifestation, or it's some kind of, it's clearly encroaching into the physical reality of those on the planet, turns out to be a product of the subconscious of this guy, and his paranoia and anxiety or whatever, but it takes physical form. and also in the film The Shining. You know, and there's, again, all of the characters' names kind of escape me, but, the son of the main protagonist has his little friend, who speaks to him, you know, and tells him things, as it were. You know, that's a little entity that's unique to him. But then one of the other characters begins to be able to sort of tap into this because he shares the same, what in the film they call a gift, you know, maybe a curse, you know, but which is like, you know, some form of ESP. So, and those are just a couple of things that sprung to mind about that. But, you talk about this idea of the, you know, of egregores and collective, unconscious and the manifestations of that. It also this then reminded me of, you know, we spoke earlier about, you know, the Greys, you know, the classic sort of, you know, alien, vision manifestation. When we have, there's another interesting layer to theorizing about all of this. When people have not only encounter similar entities in altered states or in dream states, but when they do it seemingly in this 3D reality. And I'm thinking now about UFO sightings, whether it's like, lights in the sky, creatures, whatever it happens to be. It's one thing for one person to say, I saw this and it was more real than real. But when you do, for example, the Phoenix Lights, if you Google that, it's a famous supposed UFO sighting in Arizona a few years back. When we collectively have these, and I can turn to you as we're stood in, you know, a cornfield or whatever and say, did you see that? And you say, yes, I did. But then other people did not see it. And it registered somewhere like, oh, that was on our radar. You know, we saw that. And someone else said, well, on all our electromagnetic, you know, sensory stuff, there's nothing there at all. That just a whole other level of probably more questions than answers, really. But it's still, I think, relevant to this inquiry.
It does. It suggests again, doesn't it, that the power of human consciousness, both collectively and individually, is far more powerful than we believe, and that we can, in some way, draw these things from somewhere else. For instance, you know, funnily enough, somebody posted on my Facebook wall that very sequence from Forbidden Planet yesterday.
Oh, wow.
after they'd read my book, and they actually showed that sequence. I think it might have even been today. And of course, you know, I love Forbidden Planet, and I thought it was just a fascinating idea. And in The Shining, of course, the little boy, I have a whole section, as you probably know, on invisible friends.
Yeah, well, that's what made me think of it. Yeah.
What Halliwell calls invisikids. And again, it seems that, you know, the young mind can create these thought forms that seem to have independence of them and can manipulate things. Now, is this an explanation for poltergeist activity? We know from research that poltergeist activity, the William Roll book, for instance, discusses this, is that the poltergeist is created. Normally there'll be a pubescent girl or somebody like that who is going through a difficult phase of growing up, and suddenly poltergeists appear. We also have the issue of, and indeed one of the sections that should have been in the book, but I ran out of words. I couldn't put it in. There was so much more. There were at least 2 books in this book, so I had to reduce it down. But I had a whole section on multiple personality syndrome or dissociative personality syndrome, and how, again, human consciousness can split itself into individual entities. So even our idea of selfhood can break down. And of course, you know, in my earlier books, I have the concept of the daemon and the eidolon. And my next book will be drawing that out into a much broader hypothesis about psychology and how we can go forward in terms of psychology. But these things seem to be integral to us. And again, you know, the egregorial, I think, is also, we could also call it the zeitgeist or the Weltgeist, in that there do seem to be movies and films and poems and everything else that seem to be embodying these ideas. You know, and of course, we both love movies, and there's just so many examples of this taking place. Now, again, if so many people think about the same thing, you know, think about a fictional character, can they come into existence? And this may explain, in my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I cite many examples of writers who had written fictional characters that they then subsequently encounter in consensual reality. which again is odd and weird. It seems that our relationship with the reality around us is far closer. And I think it is to do, again, with quantum physics. In 1926, Max Born came up with his conclusion that the waves that subatomic particles are not waves of physical waves like waves in water. They are statistical waves. They're like a crime wave. So again, it means they are non-physical. But we know that the act of measurement in quantum physics, the twin slit experiment shows this, the act of measurement or the act of observation collapses a potentiality of a subatomic particle to be anywhere in the universe, to be in a specific location in a specific place. But before it's measured, it can be anywhere. And it's the act of measurement that actually makes that subatomic particle become solid, well, as solid as they can be, and to be in a particular place. Which again suggests that if everything is made up of subatomic particles, which it is, it means that there's a direct relationship between the act of measurement and observation and what is external. It's just at the moment, I believe, we suffer from what the ancient Greeks called amnesis. We don't realize the true nature of the reality around us. But as we develop and as we discover more about the basic building blocks of the world around us, we'll start to realize that it's not out there. It's all in here. There is no out there. We are one singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, as Bill Hicks said. And that we are partially, our consciousness is evolved in order for the universe to become self-aware. It's the universe itself becoming self-aware as we evolve.
Yes, and those last few thoughts combined with what we were saying about children and invisible friends bring me on to another very important aspect of all this, and it was something that written about is the author of The Cosmic Egg and then later The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. It might be Joseph Chilton Pearce. I think that's his name, or it's certainly a version of that. But anyway, I've got the titles of his books correct. And he talked about how consciousness evolves over the course of a human life. And essentially, he wrote a lot about children and about how we lose important dimensions of our openness of consciousness as we get older. And he was saying that between ages of 0 and 6, children are in one state of consciousness, which is basically almost psychedelic tripping, which might explain some of their behavior. Then between 6 and 12, another one, and then between 12 and 18, a different one again, all gradually moving towards the kind of numbed, dulled, programs, unchanging states that many people end up in. And this leads me, the main point I'm making here is that belief and expectation can affect perception. So the childlike mind is open, no preconceived ideas. But the adult mindset, in relation to a lot of what we've been talking about, said, this is not possible. This cannot exist. Therefore, I cannot see it. And this explains, again, you think about the little boy in The Shining, seeing all this stuff and being freaked out by all this stuff, and the adults are going, what's wrong with you, son? We only have to look at probably our own pets for an example of this,
Yeah.
Dogs hearing things that we can't hear, cats attacking shadows on the wall, but as far as the cat's concerned, there's something there. So our beliefs and our expectations affect our perception. And if you then map that onto the materialist, reductionist Western mindset, this ultra scientific one, then of course you're going through life and into experiences with this predetermined idea of what is possible. And naturally that excludes so much from your senses, from your experience.
That's an excellent point. And I'm reminded here, I have a section on the writings of Henri Corbin, who was a French writer, and he was fascinated by Sufism, the esoteric form of Islam. And he discussed in great detail what he called the imaginal realm. And the imaginal realm is just as real as this realm, and is again brought in by by consciousness. Now, could this explain in many ways why it is that in more religious times or in more spiritual times, the manifestations are more around? They're there because they were around. And, you know, when people see BVMs, the Blessed Virgin Marys, when they see them at Fatima and Lourdes and everything else as well, it seems to be that they're drawn into by the expectations of the crowds, and they fulfill the expectations. And in my book, this is what I argue, that the Greys are just fulfilling our expectations. We're now expecting them to be in flying machines, in spaceships. You know, in the 1880s, 1890s, they expected them to be in airships. And of course, we had the great flap in North America of the airships. And the airships were being seen everywhere. And then they mysteriously disappear. Then the image starts to change. It's as if we manipulate our culture, and our culture creates these things. And one of my final points, and it's something I'd love to write about in a future book, which intrigued me in my research and my previous books, was the amount of times that physicists seem to be bringing into existence subatomic particles.
Yes, so they had this. Sorry to cut across you, but they had this with the Higgs boson. So many people wrote, did the scientists at CERN bring the Higgs boson into existence because they so much wanted to discover it, to see it?
Correct, because there was they were looking for the muon, and there was an American physicist called E. Rabi. I think it was E. Rabi, and they say they postulate something, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's an act of desperation. You know, for example, in 1900, Max Planck did not. As he said, in an act of desperation, he plugged in some certain numbers and thought the only way I can explain the observed phenomenon that I'm seeing is that energy comes in quanta. It's not continuous. It comes in quanta. And then lo and behold, we find everywhere quantum physics develops. Now, again, E. Rabi, when they discovered the muon, because they weren't expecting it, it's actually called the particle zoo. Marcus Chown in his book calls it the particle zoo, as if we are bringing them to existence by thinking about them. But he turned around when they discovered one particular subatomic particle. He said, who ordered that? And it was as if they were bringing them into existence. And I just believe that even our science is created by, it's culturally based. It's even to do with the way our language works, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the way in which words seem to create the world around us. You know, that the idea that the ancient Greeks started to think of objects in space with identities because their language was the first language that actually had sounds tied to letters, like dog, D-O-G. Obviously, that's not Greek. Slos is Greek for dog. But using the example, D-O-G, the letters D-O-G make the sound dog. And then we have an idea of an abstraction of dog on the page. And we start to think differently then. And we think differently all the time. And the world is created around us. We create the world as we go along. And I think the new world and the new paradigm, you know, again, you know, it's something I've cited many times about the idea of the theory of scientific revolutions, Cohn's famous book. The idea is that the revolutions take place not because the information is out there, but we create the information to facilitate the change. Very intriguing.
Well, didn't someone once say in the beginning was the Word?
Didn't they just? Yes. And the Word was made flesh. And the Word, and you know, the creation, everything, we bring into existence the world around us. And I feel that I'm tripping on the edge of something really, really exciting at this model. I get so excited sometimes. And sometimes I'm in complete awe of the amount of information that is being pulled together here. You know, we've got all these pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. We just need to put them together. And we could change the world.
The world is changing, Anthony, and I trust for the better. Just a closing thought from me, one little brief anecdote because it relates to all this, and it happened to me quite recently, and that was a dream experience I had. And in this dream, I don't remember much about the details of the dream, and it almost doesn't matter, but I encountered someone that I knew, but that I was, part of my life a very long time ago, and I haven't seen for a very long time. And of them, I just remember, this is what I woke up with, this experience, this thought. I asked, what are you doing here? And they simply said, I have dreams too. And,
wow.
Yeah. So it was like, well, I'm allowed to come in here as well. But I have done a lot of work and a lot of research on extraterrestrial life, and I know it's something that interests you as well. And a lot of people have theorized that the universe should be teeming with life, quote unquote. It should be everywhere. And yet, so far, we have found no evidence whatsoever of anything out there. And I know the out there is unimaginably vast, and we haven't even begun to probe it. But so far, nothing, no sign of anything. And people say, oh, hang on a minute, there's this, there's that. Yeah, we might have found some water on Mars or whatever, but there's no concrete evidence, no sign of life. And there's an interesting collection of writing in a book called Inner Paths to Outer Space.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. And so this...
Great book.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. And this has led me round to a closing thought, which is all of this, the universe is teeming with life, but it isn't... We might be just a very rare example of this sort of kind of fleshy biological stuff stuck on a rock. That might not be the dominant form of life in the universe, that it might be on other levels, John Lilly's 9 levels, for example. It might be elsewhere, and that we are that unique maybe and rare and special because, there's almost nothing else, or perhaps nothing else that's manifested just quite like us. But most of the rest of it is doing something else on other levels.
I think that is superb. I couldn't even add to that because that is a fantastic observation that I'd never thought of before. But of course it is. The idea that there are other life forms and we're looking in the wrong place. And we are, as you say, we're maybe a form of algae that's sitting on a rock and don't see anything else because we don't exist. We're like Abbott's flat world creatures, that we just don't see it. And it's in the psychical realm. I hate that term, but I can't think of anything else. But that I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's areas of more research there for us. So Greg, thank you for that one.
Well, I think you've got many more books in you, Anthony, along these lines. And I hope you pick up these threads and, pursue them. But anyway, today we've been talking about your latest, just out, widely available, The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. Before we close out, tell people details of your website or anything else you might be working on or want to share.
Right. Okay. One of the most important things at the moment for me is to build up the number of people who are following me on Instagram. So if I need to get to 1,000, I've only been there comparatively recently, but once I've got 1,000, I can do far more exciting things in terms of postings. So if you want to join me there, I'm Cheat the Ferryman 54. So it's Cheat the Ferryman 54 on there. I'm also very active on Facebook. Recently started a new Facebook wall as well called the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, where I'm podcasting quite regularly, doing Facebook Live. So check that out. Again, just look up Anthony Peake and you'll find the links to there. In terms of events and things, I've got a few events coming up, but the big event is one I'm doing at Contact in the Desert on the last weekend of May in Indian Wells in California, where there'll be myself. I'm doing 2 panel discussions. I'm doing a workshop and I'm doing a lecture. And with the workshop, I will have at least 3 or 4 Lucia lights, hypnagogic lights with me. And it'll be the first time that I'll be discussing in detail my overall overarching theory of reality, or my hypothesis, or as my critics say, my speculations. Website is anthonypeake.com. So please join me on there. But it's very much Instagram that is the place I'm posting regularly on there. So all my latest news is on there, my ideas, my thoughts, my feelings. This will be up on there. So it's Instagram and Facebook. Thank
Splendid. You. Anthony, thank you once again for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg. As always, a wonderful interview.